Dr. Collins, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Uh, let's start with a big question, Dr. Collins. How did Rome become so important to Christianity?
Well, I suppose to some extent, Rome couldn't fail to become important to Christianity because it was the most important city of the time
Yeah.
when, as it were, the early development of Christianity. And it was also by far the largest city in the whole of the Roman Empire, the largest by a long way in the western half of the Roman Empire, and was the center of political and economic life throughout the empire.
Hmm.
So it was going to be a major center of Christianity and a major center of interest. And in that sense, I suspect if either Peter or Paul had not been there, something would have had to have been invented. And indeed, I'm rather assuming or taking for granted the traditions that they were there, but the evidence that they actually were there is rather harder to find. And that
Evidence is hard to find, but in the Vatican itself, there is allegedly Peter's remains, right?
that is certainly controversial. They had
Oh,
excavations that took place when Pope Pius XI died in 1939. And they were building a tomb for him in the Vatican grotto, which runs almost the whole way underneath St. Peter's, and is the usual burial place for the popes, not obviously for Francis I, who's being buried in or has been buried in Santa Maria Maggiore. They found traces of an early Roman cemetery from the first century AD,
like a
which,
necropolis?
well, no, actually, it had been in the open air. It was like a little village of streets
Oh,
with small houses. I mean, you see the same kind of thing nowadays, for example, in Portugal. They have these kind of cemeteries that consist of sort of house-shaped, I mean, they may be sort of 10, 12 feet high, but basically house-shaped monuments for families and individuals. And this was something like that. But it had been buried. The whole thing
wow.
had been covered in earth in probably in the middle of the fourth century when the first Basilica of St. Peter's was built. And that was built on that site. And to do that, they had to flatten the hill. And therefore, this cemetery, which is where the possible remains of Peter were found, then came to be buried. And because of the interest of that, I mean, war was looming at the time, but because of the interest of that, and also because of the sensitivity that they didn't know what they were going to find, the new Pope, Pius XII, permitted excavations to take place, but in conditions of strict secrecy and with the agreement that nothing would be released until it had been sort of thoroughly reviewed and as it were, discussed for potential negative or indeed positive consequences for the church, because
Yeah.
obviously the whole question of whether Peter had been both the first bishop of Rome and also whether he'd been buried in Rome was a long-term controversial issue between Catholics and Protestants. And the fear was that the excavations could turn up something that, if you like, would give the Catholic side a winning hand. Or on the other hand, it could be that something would be discovered that could undermine the suggestion that he'd been buried there. And so the excavations were carried out very cautiously and very secretively. And initially, they weren't actually allowed to get anywhere near the uh, under the 16th century main altar that you still see today. But by 1941, this cemetery was being so well excavated, and at the same time, a mosaic of definite Christian significance had been found inside one of the tombs. And so the Pope permitted the excavations to get even closer under the altar. And that's where they found what was interpreted as a possible site of Peter's burial, which was to say it was a wall, a red wall. The wall itself, they thought, was probably only built around about 200, but it covered or ran across a kind of a rectangular space underneath itself and slightly at an angle to the line of the wall. And they found traces of what looked like a little shrine having been built onto the wall. And therefore, they thought that what was in that kind of cavity under the wall must be significant. And they indeed found a collection of bones there. And these were inspected, again, because of the conditions of secrecy, they were inspected by the Pope's doctor. And he said what they had found were the bones of a mature man of some considerable size, probably aged in his 60s or early 70s. And this, if you like, sounded as if it might fit the bill for Peter. But they, fortunately, rather than going public, this was 42 in the middle of the Second World War, and as I say, they were being cautious for many reasons, decided to, particularly as this doctor was himself not an authority on as it were, anatomical investigation, they asked for a second opinion and brought in an Italian professor. And he discovered that indeed there was some bones of a man, but also bones of two women and several animals, and possibly even a mouse.
Oh, wow.
So the whole thing was a bit embarrassing, but at least nobody had said anything publicly. And strangely enough, just a few weeks later, as the excavations continue, another wall, it was actually a slightly later wall that was used to support this first red wall, was discovered. And that too had bones, but in this case, actually built into a cavity in the wall. And the man who the Pope had appointed in charge, I mean, he was a Vatican official, to oversee the excavations. I mean, he wasn't an archaeologist, but he went down there secretly after the excavators had gone away for the night, taking with him the foreman who basically reported to him what the excavators were doing, what they found. And he went down there and he removed this second set of bones and took them to his office, where they remained until after he died, nearly 10 years later. And these bones, when they subsequently came to be investigated, actually did turn out to be the bones of a mature man, possibly of the kind of age previously suggested. So it was very complicated.
That does sound complicated, yeah.
Two sets of bones. And for a while, caution prevailed, because obviously all of these sites, I mean, these two walls, the red wall and then this second smaller supporting wall, had been dated no earlier than the end of the second century, around about 200, possibly a little later.
Okay,
so
yeah.
Anything, as it were, found in them had to have been put in place earlier, but there was no way of saying how much earlier. But then one of the excavators, who was a friend of Pope Paul VI, persuaded him to announce in I think it was 1963, 1965, that they had actually discovered the bones of St. Peter. And this should have been, shall we say, a remarkable revelation, but actually it never got really promoted very strongly because of the
It didn't get publicity?
It got some, but not a lot. I think largely because the questions remained, the doubts, that there had been so many kind of gaps in the if you regarded it, so to speak, as a crime scene. The actual handling of the evidence and the oversight of the evidence, there were so many problems and as it were gaps in the transmission that nobody really wanted to push it.
And then they may get an answer that they don't really want, that maybe it wasn't the bone of bones of St. Peter. One question that I have, and perhaps Dr. Collins, this is simplistic, is now in the year 2025, or even like, in the last couple of decades, could they not do a DNA test on some of these bones to see whether or not those bones include sort of DNA composition of a man from the Middle East? After all, St. Peter was from the Middle East. It was from Bethlehem or Jerusalem. I forget which one, but
Oh, he'd come from Galilee, wouldn't
oh
he?
yeah, okay, yeah.
Right.
Still, that general area to see what that would sort of add some credence to all of this these claims.
It could be. I have to say, I don't know enough about, as it were, the techniques of DNA testing to say whether or not you could be sure that
Yeah,
that
yeah,
such
yeah. Good
would.
point.
But assuming you could, there would still be a certain element of ambiguity, because I mean, I don't think you could necessarily pinpoint DNA quite so sort of specifically, both in terms of geographical location
Yeah,
you might get some suggestive results.
suggestive.
Uh,
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
the test would probably be the best you could hope for.
yeah.
But on the other hand, I I think this as a sufficient degree of caution. And I mean, look at the controversy that has raged for years over the Turin shroud.
The Tourist Shroud. Yeah,
DNA supposedly that has established it was as it were original first century. Other that suggested that it was actually a later or yes late medieval. So I don't think you would necessarily get as it were, a knockout blow in evidence terms, and at the same time there'd be a risk of yet more controversy and possibly again a result you didn't actually want.
I totally
So
agree. Let's go back to. Go ahead. Were you going to add something?
no, I was just going to say I suspect this is one of these things where sort of leaving sleeping dogs lying is a
Sleeping
horrible
dogs. Yeah,
policy to be followed or
it's
has been followed.
probably for the best not to disturb the long tradition. Let's go back to my original question. Obviously, I know quite a bit about Rome's history, the Eternal City, and its importance in that first, second, third, and fourth centuries AD. Um, what interests me in the sort of the premise for asking that question, how did Rome become the center of Christianity? Um, is what is the following. What piqued my interest, Dr. Collins, is that okay? Peter and Paul go to Rome. There's that story, that tradition in Christianity. Great. But as we look at the history of the papacy, there are about, I forget, 8 to 10 other popes who are also born in Africa or the Middle East that they also travel to Rome and end up in Rome. I asked that question sort of because at that time there were other very important cities to Christianity, for example, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and later Constantinople. Was there ever any discussion within Christianity? This is before there's any split in Christianity that Antioch should be the center, or I don't know, Alexandria or Jerusalem, or was it the case that everything still gravitated towards Rome?
Not necessarily. I think the issue really is one of authority. That, as you mentioned, there were these other great patriarchal sees which were recognized as such from a fairly early stage,
Mm-hmm,
uh,
mm-hmm.
to which Constantinople was added. There was a lot of argument as to, if you like, precedence. But Rome essentially, the tradition that develops in Rome, I mean, particularly from the mid 5th century onwards, is that the See of Rome is not, as it were, the equal. It is superior to the others. The others were collegial. I mean, this didn't mean there weren't disagreements, and some quite serious disagreements between, say, Antioch and Alexandria, and both of them in Constantinople. But essentially, they were a more kind of collegial body of patriarchates, whereas the tradition of the Roman Church was that the holder of the See of Rome, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, had a special authority. I mean, the tradition of this develops in stages over the centuries, and you can see and you mark the different stages as they advance. But essentially, it was always in favor of saying that Rome had, and here they made use, obviously, of the famous passage from Matthew of, you are Peter, and on this rock. But again, that interpretation is not necessarily as self-evident as the Roman tradition would make out. For example, in the 3rd century, the same passage was quoted by Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, to justify all bishops having the spiritual authority of binding and loosing, and he was not alone.
Oh, so saying that on this rock I build my church, so they were saying that's not exclusive to Rome, where Peter was allegedly buried. That really applies to all bishops around the world of Christianity.
Yeah, that's what Cyprian argued, and they say he certainly wasn't alone. And others followed that line, whereas Rome used it as a kind of the bedrock on which the tradition of, as it were, unique papal authority rested. And in that sense, and again, there were no other sort of great patriarchates in the West to challenge Rome. So you do have quite a different system, and of course this leads to almost a kind of, this is something I think you want to talk about later, but the divide in the 11th century, between the Church of Rome and the Church of Constantinople, which the latter is speaking really for the Eastern Orthodox tradition.
And we're going to get to that in a second, and because I think that's a fascinating turn of events and history in and of itself. But before we go there, Dr. Collins, this is what I'm wondering. In the start of our conversation, you talked about how it would be sort of inevitable. That's my word. You didn't use that word, but that's sort of my conclusion of what you said. It would be inevitable for Rome to be the center of Christianity because it really was the center of the Roman Empire, political center, or the sort of the biggest urban focus and all of that at that time. At some point, that shifts to Constantinople. Constantinople becomes this humongous city, and it remains so for many, many centuries. So Rome no longer plays that oversized role. Why doesn't Christianity shift to Constantinople at that time as a consequence of that political shift?
Again, it's because Rome has no rival in the West. It's not going to be challenged. I mean, essentially, what you do get is the split between East and West.
I see.
Represented by the Great Schism in the 11th century. But there is no way in which one of the Eastern patriarchates can really establish itself. I mean, partly because there are a number of them, and partly because the Orthodox tradition is one in which authority and change can only come as a result of the decisions of councils, that the bishops gathering together in councils, particularly when all of the churches of Christendom are represented, and therefore you have an ecumenical council. It's only an ecumenical council that can make decisive decisions in matters, particularly of doctrine, but also in terms of major decisions about discipline. And Rome, on the other hand, from, I say, certainly from the 5th century, and there are stronger elements to be found even earlier, says, no, that is not the case. That the council, I mean, literally, in certain occasions, the Pope sends a letter saying, you mustn't make a decision in the council. This is what I have decided. Have this read out and just agree to it. And
Oh,
the
wow. Okay,
they
this is
we're not having.
absolute power.
Oh yes, that's what they were claiming and demanding. But as I say, it didn't work because they had no way in which that authority could be imposed. I mean, the Roman claim could never actually be enforced. In various disputes, the emperors, Byzantine emperors, would almost inevitably tend to support their own bishops. But there are certain occasions in which they did, for example, try to, and there are these major sort of heresies in the early church and divides in the church in the East. And sometimes some of the emperors did look to Rome to provide a kind of authoritative guidance. But again, this was not usually popular with the bishops in the East. So there really is a conflict between two concepts of authority. One, the heir of Peter, speaking authoritatively and making judicial rulings, doctrinal decrees on the basis of that authority that came from the Petrine apostolic foundation of the See of Rome.
And
And
that
on the
would be
other,
the Pope in Rome as we know it.
yes,
Okay.
yes. And on the other hand, the Eastern tradition that it was only the ecumenical council that could make such important changes in doctrine, or indeed any other sort of serious matter needed to be discussed in councils, and that there was nobody who had that kind of personal authority that could be, as it were, used to enforce decisions, theological decisions, or disciplinary decisions.
Okay, there's two things that stand out for me, Dr. Collins, as you explain this background. I'm going to just share them with you. You tell me if I'm correct in sort of distilling what you said. One is that, unlike in the East, in the West, and I largely define that as sort of Western Europe and Northern Europe, there was no other city center to rival Rome, versus in the East, you had Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem itself, Alexandria, and other places. So it was multi-centered versus just a singular urban center that had a long history, i.e. Rome. So there's that. The second thing is that in the West, you had a person in the body of the Pope who had absolute power, who Christians look to for guidance. But in the East, this tradition developed that no, you had a body, a council that made decisions. And that really sort of, those are two different traditions that are developing. That's fascinating. So let's talk about the split. You mentioned this a couple of times. At some point, East and West Christianity split. How does that happen? And what's the background to it?
Again, you need to look at the historical context because the basic difference we've been discussing in the view of the source of authority was long established, but the papacy, the bishopric of Rome, had in the 10th century and in the early part of the 11th century been essentially dominated by local aristocratic families in the city, and there were a whole series of scandals and whether or not all of the stories told about the popes of that time are true, because there were various, if you like, propaganda reasons why opponents of the papacy at the time, or particular popes, might wish to circulate some of these stories. But I mean, certainly it did look as if the Roman Church had just become subservient to the politics of the city, and suitable people were being appointed. And at the same time, in this period, you're getting reform movements outside of Rome, and also there are some in northern Italy, but largely sort of further north in France. I mean, particularly the monastic order of Cluny, looking for real change in terms of the conduct of monastic life, but also promoting sort of wider ideas of reform. And there are similar or other kind of movements of
And these reforms are not yet Protestant. We're not there yet.
Oh,
That comes
no,
several centuries
oh no,
later.
this is very much a kind of reform within the
Yeah.
existing church. And as a result of largely, I say, of local politics, eventually some of the reformers actually acquire control of the papal office, and you get what's called the Reform Papacy, really from the middle of the 11th century on into the 12th century. There is a succession of many of them actually come from outside Rome, unlike their predecessors who had been, if you like, products of local aristocratic feuding and faction.
Mm-hmm.
And they take a much stronger stand, both in terms of the relationship between the popes and the secular rulers, but also in terms of promoting and reviving the claims of the special authority of the papacy.
Reviving that. Okay.
And trying, if you like, to make it into a reality. And to some extent, they succeed, largely because there are conditions in the West are such that there are various parties, not least, as I say, the monastic reformers and others, who are only too pleased to see a reform in the heart of the papacy. But on the other hand, you're going to have the kind of relationship with the Eastern churches, obviously by now, all but the See of Constantinople, of the other great patriarchates, are in territories under Islamic rule. But this didn't mean that there was no communication or contact. But obviously relations between the two halves of Christendom, if you like, were focused on Rome and Constantinople.
So what you're
And
saying is that Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, those are the things that three cities that I can think of were under Islamic rule at that time, but they still had Christian bishops within them.
Oh yes, very
Yeah.
much so. In a tradition unbroken, and indeed large, if not even majority Christian populations. So that
okay.
But on the other hand, contact was slightly more intermittent, and there could be much less influence exercised by the Eastern churches other than Constantinople in relations with Rome. And it was in a diplomatic mission to discuss basically two issues, which you would hardly have thought to be of enormous significance. That the schism broke out, that as it were, a formal rupture was declared. The two issues: one was the use of leavened bread, i.e., either the flatbreads that are used in the Catholic and indeed Protestant churches, as opposed to what you might call ordinary bread, which was used in the Orthodox Church, in the Eucharist. The other issue was a theological one, and that's the double procession of the Holy Spirit. That in the Nicene Creed, as established in the Council of Nicaea, and which was it wasn't the only creed, but it was the main kind of touchstone of orthodoxy. You have the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father, who with the Father and Son together are worshipped and glorified in the English translation. In the 5th century, early 6th century, in southern France or Spain, the creed received a slight alteration, where instead of saying the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, the Latin phrase filioque, and from the Son, so was introduced. And so the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. this may not seem a very significant.
Wait, that's not the same thing then. That means that they're both almost equal, the Father and the Son, if the Holy Spirit proceeds from both.
Yes, you can imagine it like a triangle. That in the original version, God the Father is at the point of the triangle, and the Holy Spirit and the Son are at the bottom, in the bottom corners of the triangle. And with the adding of the filioque, it's sort of inverted. So you've got the flat part of the triangle on the top, the Father and the Son, and the Holy. And this, I mean, the idea didn't spread very quickly until the time of Charlemagne and the Frankish Empire around 800. And it was then adopted by Charlemagne and the Frankish Church, but completely resisted by Rome. The popes had nothing, absolutely refused to accept this change to the Nicene Creed. And that carried on for 200 years until the beginning of the 11th century, as a result of a political intervention by the then Emperor Henry II. The Pope of the time
was Henry II of the Holy Roman Empire, or was he also a Frankish king?
No, he was an Ottonian king. He basically, I mean, he ruled in what's now Germany.
Germany, okay.
So there was a Frankish dynasty in the western part of the Carolingian, or what had been the Carolingian Empire.
Carolingian Empire, okay.
But as a result of intervening in Italy to restore a pope, the Pope of the time, this is in 1016, finally accepted the introduction of the filioque.
The thing that you were telling me, where the flat part of the triangle is on top.
That's right.
Procession of the Holy Spirit comes from Father and Son.
From the Father and from the Son, yes. So,
okay. Which is different. That's what's happening in Constantinople.
Oh, yes. Where there was no suggestion whatsoever other than the single procession of the Holy Spirit. This was a newly accepted doctrine in Rome, but in 1054, the new Pope sends one of his cardinals to Constantinople to discuss these two issues, which have become contentious. One, the use of leavened bread by the Western Church, and the second, the introduction of the filioque, the double procession. And this particular cardinal, whose name was Humbert, seems to have been a rather undiplomatic and a distinctly fiery character. And even while the discussions were going on, he apparently broke into a Eucharistic service in Hagia Sophia, the Cathedral of Constantinople, and placed a papal excommunication on the high altar, while the Patriarch of Constantinople was performing the rite. And not surprisingly, a few days later, the Patriarch reciprocated, excommunicating the Pope. And the schism thus created lasted until 1965.
Wow, from 1054, that's a long time to be upset at each other. 1965. Yeah, 1054 to 1965. Wow.
It looked at first as if it might, well, relatively easily be settled. I mean, there had been previous schisms. There's an Acacian schism. It starts in 492 and goes on for about 20 years. But this lasted for over 600 years. And there were points at which Constantinople, if you like, needed the assistance of the West, particularly as the Turkish conquests of the Byzantine Empire developed. And there were various points in the late Middle Ages at which they were prepared, if you like, to settle some of these issues. But it never quite happened. And really, although these issues might seem, as I say, relatively obscure, they really did represent two prime examples of this issue of authority. that, if you like, they were not, well, obviously to the participants, they were important in themselves, but behind them, there was this fundamental divide over authority. And this is why the papacy, which itself, as I say, had only just come to accept the double procession, took the dispute less than 50 years later with Constantinople so seriously, because it was essentially that Constantinople was refusing to say that, well, Rome has decided that the double procession is the correct doctrine. Therefore, we ought to accept it. Whereas, if you like, the Eastern position was anything like this could only be agreed by an ecumenical council. And of course, in practice, you couldn't really expect to hold an ecumenical council when most of the churches of Eastern Christendom were both in
Muslim
under
rule.
and potentially, of course, all sorts of military conflicts and things were going on involved with that or independent of that. So there was no way in which a major ecumenical council could have been held anyway. So, as I say, the two sides, but it represents really the kind of culmination of the two traditions that are absolutely in conflict over the nature of authority. And this is also ultimately why it couldn't be solved until basically it no longer mattered.
Wow. So this was not to make light of it, but these two issues of leavened bread and double procession versus a single procession were essentially about who's the boss within Christianity, whether it emanates from some sort of council or leadership of Constantinople or Rome. I want to ask this. There's another split in Christianity that comes later. I already alluded to it. The Protestant Reformation, Council of Worms, as in WORM in Germany, and Luther. We all know about that. I'm familiar with that, and I'm familiar with all the protests and rebellions that it caused by the masses of people. What we just talked about, you and I, this split between Rome and Constantinople, this sounds like it was just a turf war between the high levels of clergy. That's my suggestion. Am I correct? Because I don't even know. Would the masses even know this issue existed? Would they even understand leavened bread versus, the Trinity or these sort of things?
I suspect they wouldn't have understood them, certainly not in the same way as the clergy.
Yeah.
On the other hand, people do tend to kind of take sides, a bit like football matches,
Yeah.
so that they would feel that their way of doing things was right, and to be told that, as it were, the other side. I mean, that might be easier to understand in terms of the bread that is used in the Eucharist,
Because it's so
rather.
visual, and you touch it and you know which one is, good, which one is bad, that sort of thing.
Whereas I suspect the double procession probably would have foxed a lot of people. But
Yeah.
on the other hand, if they felt that, shall we be emotive and say, foreigners were trying to force change
Yeah.
on traditional belief, that would get them annoyed. So even if they didn't understand the theological niceties of it, it was the fact that the other lot were trying to introduce novelty, and that they were trying to break with tradition. And again, I mean, both sides thought that they represented the tradition. I mean, the extraordinary thing with the history of the papacy is, by and large, it's an institution that claims to represent tradition and to uphold the, as it were, the orthodox, the authoritative, without making changes, but at the same time actually develops ideologically, theologically, institutionally, in all sorts of different ways across time, while claiming not to be doing so.
Interesting. And so the emotional charge that was behind the split in uh, the Christian church, part of it was cultural and also to some extent, we're Westerners, they're Easterners, phobia, just different cultures
Yeah, and language too.
and language.
Obviously, the Western knowledge of Greek diminished rapidly in the sort of from the middle of the first millennium onwards. And similarly, it's not that the Easterners, after really the 7th century, Latin was very much a foreign tongue. So the two sides were speaking different languages. And this,
Literally.
literally. And at the same time, this did have an effect on particularly the sort of papal understanding of the Greek arguments, because Greek, shall we say, could make subtler distinctions. You get this, for example, in some of the theological disputes in the 4th to 7th centuries, particularly with the sort of so-called Monophysites and the Monothelites. There are very fine distinctions that it's not easy to translate into Latin. So that quite often the popes and their advisors didn't really understand what some of the issues were that the Greeks were worried about, and could take sides in disputes that they themselves weren't sort of fully understanding, or where other factors, as it were, led them to take the positions that they did, political and ones and social ones, rather than because they understood the minutiae of the arguments.
Um, did the church from the East in Constantinople have, I don't want to use the word embassy, that doesn't really happen until later, but did they have some sort of resident representative in Rome and vice versa?
Certainly, Rome had a representative in Constantinople, not, so to speak, because of the church connection, but because that was the residence of the emperor. So
Yeah.
there was always effectively a high-level diplomat at the emperor's court until relations there finally broke down. Really, from the from the end of the 5th century, the 6th century, up to the 8th century, there would normally be somebody called the papal apocrisiarius, who was, as a high-level member of the papal court, who would be resident in Constantinople and serve as the kind of the papal ambassador. There wasn't an equivalent in the other direction. Largely because, of course, throughout most of that period, the Rome itself was imperial territory, so that there were civil officials answerable to the emperor, including in Rome itself, as well as in other parts of Italy. So that it was a slightly different kind of relationship.
And the emperor was in Constantinople.
Yeah.
There are a couple of interesting terms that I shared with you before we started our conversation in the podcast. One was called the Byzantine Papacy. Tell us about that, please.
That, I think, could be used to refer to the period I was talking about.
Yeah.
Because with the end of the Roman Empire in the West in 476, then you get these successive kingdoms in Italy, the kingdom of Odoacer, and then the Ostrogothic kingdom. But in the middle of the 6th century, under the Emperor Justinian, most of Italy is reconquered by armies sent from Constantinople, only to lose much of northern Italy and parts of the south to the Lombards by the end of the 6th century. But this establishes various places, notably Ravenna and also Rome. And although the communication is sometimes cut, much of the territory in between, in sort of central Italy, and parts of the south are in imperial hands and are governed by imperial governors and military officials who are either appointed or indeed sent from Constantinople. And for really until the late 8th century, the papacy as an institution remains politically subservient to the empire.
So the Pope in Rome is uh, not in the hands, but is subject to checks and sort of commands from Constantinople.
Yes, absolutely.
So could a person become Pope? I guess for a bishop to become Pope, they would have to have the consent of Constantinople.
In theory, it
In
didn't
theory.
always, but essentially for most of that period, the elected Bishop of Rome would have to wait for imperial confirmation, which almost always came, though there were one or two sort of points of conflict. And indeed, in one case, Justinian's wife, the Empress Theodora, had a newly appointed pope removed by the soldiers, and a candidate more suited to her interests was installed, causing further problems. Because of course the previous candidate, I mean, they've, if you like, formally, well, he was coerced into declaring that he had abdicated. But in fact, the appointment of his successor took place before he'd abdicated. So there were then arguments about the legitimacy of his successor, who himself was lured to Constantinople and subjected to even more sort of strenuous pressure. And indeed, he had to try and escape from the detention in Constantinople and take refuge in the church across the Sea of Marmara.
Oh, wow.
And the imperial forces tried to drag him off the altar, and he clung on, and until eventually it became so sort of embarrassing that an agreement was made. But so there were points at which either in Constantinople or in Rome itself, as it were, persuasion could be of a more practical kind, could be applied to the popes until they become really in the 7th century, almost kind of, shall we say, sort of leaders of Italian patriotism. And so the last time when an emperor actually tries to strong arm a pope, he orders his governor in Ravenna to take forces down to Rome and basically kidnap the Pope and send him off to Constantinople. But the Byzantine forces stationed in Rome, when they hear of what's planned, rally to defend the Pope, and the governor or exarch ends up having to take refuge under the Pope's bed for fear of being lynched by his own troops. So from that point onwards, there was no possibility that the emperors could actively sort of coerce a pope.
Yeah. So the power of Byzantine Empire over Rome begins to recede from that point on. Just one comment about Empress Theodora for our audience. This is not the only political intrigue she was involved with. She actually had a lot of political stories to her. Justinian's wife. You should read up on that. Now, how about later empires? So, for example, did the Holy Roman Empire to the north ever enforce its own popes in Rome, or did France later do that?
Oh yes, well, the history of the papacy really from the 9th century onwards is one of, on the one hand, the popes trying to establish as well a political presence, particularly in central Italy, but they had various claims that they advanced, some based on spurious documents, to other areas in the north and the south, and they claimed later a kind of suzerainty over the kingdom of Sicily. basically to try and provide both estates, land that would provide resources, as it were, money for the maintenance of the papal administration, and also for charitable purposes. And at the same time, with the kind of numerous conflicts that were taking place in the Western Mediterranean and more widely throughout these centuries, they sometimes needed active protection, particularly with the Arab conquest of Sicily and their raids on southern Italy. There was a serious threat to Rome of that direction, as there had been previously during the period of the Lombard Kingdom, where successive Lombard kings tried to take over Rome and basically control the papacy themselves directly.
And later the Normans tried to do stuff like
the
that.
Normans, exactly.
Yeah.
So there are a whole series of these kind of crucial periods in which the papacy clearly cannot defend itself, and therefore has to look to an outside protector with, shall we say, a bigger stick than whoever's threatening them. But the danger then is, of course, that the protector can then become the next threat, and they don't want to give up the kind of independence that they, if you like, were trying to achieve in return for protection. So you have a whole series of throughout this period, well on into the late Middle Ages, and then indeed beyond, because secular control of Rome, or the threat of it, is a kind of continuous theme in papal history, right up to, of course, the 1870, when the papal states are finally dissolved, and great sort of shock and resistance on the part of traditionalists, particularly the Pope of the time, Pius IX, the fear that with their, as it were, their territory, their independent territory removed, that the papacy itself would be, as it was, entirely dominated by secular powers. Obviously, in practice, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
But for several decades, the popes, as they saw themselves, were prisoners in the Vatican, and it was only really in the earlier part of the 20th century that negotiations with the Italian government led to the recognition of as it were, papal rights, and the whole issue disappeared. But behind it lay, well over 1,000 years of this kind of pull between the papal desire to not to be entirely sort of politically autonomous, not actually to be, if you like, a secular ruler, independent, but to have effective independence and control over the resources that were deemed to be, in fact, a sort of integral part of the papal state.
Yeah.
And at the same time, intermittent need for more active protection.
That came from kingdoms and empires that were powerful, and many of them were to the north, because the Byzantine Empire was no longer involved, and eventually itself was extinguished. A couple of follow-up questions on that. One is, correct me if I'm wrong, at what point the papacy actually moves out of Rome to France?
Oh, and with the Avignon papacy.
Yeah.
This was actually an accident.
Accident. Okay.
In the early 14th century, there had been again a fairly tempestuous period in the previous century. In part, the popes weren't always able to control Rome. There were powerful aristocratic factions. There was also had been a commune, and the popes at various points had actually lost control of the city. And at other periods, the conflicts in the city were so dangerous that the popes largely resided outside in these papal territories in central Italy. And there was also growing conflict between the popes and the rulers, the principal rulers in northern Europe, particularly at the end of the 13th century, with the King of France, who wanted to make use of papal, well, these revenues that would have gone to the papacy from the French Church. And the
So
popes,
instead of sending revenues for the Catholic Church to Rome, he wanted to use it locally in France.
he wanted to use it for his own purposes. I mean, crusading, of course, was the usual argument,
Yeah.
that the popes could agree for a percentage of the clerical revenues that would come to them, as it were, to be diverted to a lay ruler to, as it were, enable them to go on crusade. Quite often, of course, they never did go on crusade, but they took the money.
That's convenient.
One
Yeah.
series of disputes that were taking place, particularly in the time of Pope Boniface VIII, who died in 1303, and with King Philip of France. And indeed, just before Boniface died, Philip suborned one of the Pope's enemies in Rome, together with one of his own nobles, to attempt to kidnap the Pope and carry him off. He wasn't living in Rome at the time. He had to take refuge in a place called Agnani in the hills. And the King of France had this plot to have him kidnapped by, say, these agents and brought to France, where he was going to be put on trial before a council. In fact,
Wow.
although they did seize him, they got into the town and they captured him, but they then kind of fell to disagreement about what to do next, and the citizenry rose up in support of the Pope and rescued him, but he was so shocked by the whole thing that he died, and he had a brief-lived successor who tried to resolve the issue, but himself died of disease the following year. And there then follows an 11-month-long conclave in which they try to find, as it were,
11-month-long conclave. Okay.
which was not the longest by any means in that period. The longest in that period was 2 years and 10 months.
Wow. 2 years and 10 months. Okay.
But in this particular one, eventually they just can't. I mean, to some extent, in the circumstances, they probably were finding it difficult to get anybody to, shall we say, one of the cardinals. And the number of cardinals was usually quite small in this period. It was difficult to get, as it were, to settle on the candidate, or possibly a candidate who would actually agree to. So in the end, they actually appointed somebody who wasn't there. They appointed the Archbishop of Bordeaux and sent to tell him he'd been elected as Pope. And he intended to, as it were, come to Italy. I mean, he sets out from Bordeaux. He was actually a subject of the King of England, because, of course, Aquitaine was under English rule at the time. He has his consecration in Lyon, in territory owned by the King of France. But conditions in Italy had become so tumultuous that he doesn't set out he intends to go into Italy, but he delays, and he continues to delay, and he moves around with his court in Provence until he dies. And the cardinals who he's appointed, and again, in this period, you're getting the real sort of development of nepotism, where
nepotism, is that what you said?
That's it.
Yeah, nepotism. Okay.
They're actually sort of appointing family members and friends. I mean, he appoints a lot of Gascon cardinals and also several of his own relatives. And so when he dies, not surprisingly, they appoint another local French pope, who was the Bishop of Avignon. And it's he who really makes the decision not to bother to go into Italy, but to remain in Avignon. And then you get this succession. I mean, the popes effectively owned Avignon and a big swathe of territory around there through the kings of Sicily, or they were titular kings of Sicily, but they actually only controlled Naples at the time, but who were, as it were, papal vassals who owned this part of France, because they'd actually come from France, indeed to assist the papacy earlier in the previous century. And so the popes, you might say, sort of rent Avignon and eventually purchase it from their own vassals and turn it into the new center of papal administration.
And the papacy was officially in Avignon for some 6 or 7 decades, right? And then they go back to Rome.
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other question that I had, this is fascinating, Dr. Collins, that you and I can talk about it for hours on, but you mentioned something that I just wanted to go back to and get some clarification. You said spurious documents. Now I'm going back to my own memory. I recall there was some alleged document, some sort of grant, perhaps from Constantine or someone. You're shaking your head. You're about to correct me. That gave Rome to the papacy. Tell us about that, please.
That's right. Yeah, the donation of Constantine,
Okay.
which was accepted by and large. I mean, one of the German emperors, Otto III, around about the year 1000, was about the only person recorded before the 15th century to have doubted its authenticity. But it seems to have been concocted in the 8th century, but was accepted widely as a genuine grant by the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, of these special authority, special powers of the bishops of Rome. And this was the basis for a lot of the arguments.
Religious authority, or also secular political.
Also
Okay.
Similarly, of course, some of the claims to territory were based on slightly, shall we say, optimistic documents that were, again, widely accepted. And indeed, in some cases, still are. But in the 8th century, the popes claimed that the Frankish ruler Pippin III had made them a donation that gave them virtually all of the territory that had been in imperial hands in Italy, all the way from Ravenna right down into the south. And
wow. Okay.
And again, they use this to try and persuade Pippin's various successors to turn that into a reality. Not with any great success, though they did actually acquire what was essentially the basis of the papal states in central Italy as a result of that. But there are a lot of forged documents, some perhaps quite blatant forgeries, others I think we would say that represented what the people who concocted them believed were the truth. So their motives may not have been entirely cynical, but they just felt that this must be the case. But unfortunately, there isn't a document to prove it. So a document could be concocted to make the case for them.
In the case of the donation of Constantine, which is one of the big ones, the one that I know, was it finally debunked? I mean, we know it's forgery now, but was it debunked in, let's say, several centuries ago?
Oh yes, in the middle of the 15th century, a Renaissance scholar called Lorenzo Valla produced he studied it intensely and produced a really definitive debunking of it.
Wow, that's
I mean, this didn't
fascinating.
stop it being continued to be sort of claimed as authentic in papal circles for a while, but essentially his authority and he wrote a treatise showing why it was spurious.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It seemed to be
So, so for the last hour, we've talked about some of the high points of the papacy. Um, its source of power. It's split with the church of the with the church in the east. Um, what is if you were to pick one um, huge issue that the church is facing now? What would that be? So for us here in America, we know that there are many issues, uh, many theological, other social, such as gay marriage, um, clerical celibacy. That the celibacy that comes and goes. It's happened in history a couple of times, and there's the Vatican financial dealings that they created scandals. Most recently, I think it was several years ago. So those are all there. But is there something much bigger that is threatening the papacy, you think?
I I wouldn't think there's any one thing that is likely to cause, shall we say, a major either collapse in papal authority or a sort of hemorrhaging of Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
I, mm, the sex scandal obviously has had an impact in many different
I
countries.
forgot to mention that. Yeah, great. Yeah.
I mean that I think is, but again, I unless they're peculiar, the next pope is sort of peculiarly insensitive. I mean, his two immediate predecessors have been moving in the right direction, perhaps fairly sort of small steps. Um, but I think unless somebody actually sort of said, if you like, the clergy are beyond reproof. I mean, the clergy can do no wrong,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I don't quite like that happening. So I don't really see a big issue.
Good,
Uh,
good.
I mean, it could be, shall we say, as seems to be happening, that the number of Catholics in Africa will and South America will rise, and perhaps will decline in Europe even more than has been the case. But who's to say? I mean, there are all sorts of different factors, but I certainly wouldn't see, nor do I see a really radical pope emerging, because I don't think that the institution could really create one. I mean,
Hmm.
radical in a really quite extraordinary kind of way. That when you look at the papal candidates, we look at their careers, um, and look at even somebody like Francis, who had a reputation for being radical, but actually was also very traditional. Um, you're never really going to get somebody who is going to, um, as it was, subvert the system,
Hmm.
claim that it is resting on false foundations, or, as it were, I mean, I don't know right what would happen, but I don't think, as I say, that the institution runs in such a way that such a person could emerge.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I don't think such a person exists, as it were, in the body uh, of cardinals at the moment,
I see.
uh, or is one likely to appear to be appointed, as it were, as a cardinal.
Do you think, we spent so much time talking about the split between East and West in the world of Christianity? Do you think in the conclave, the cardinals are now mindful of what you just said, that a huge part of uh, uh, Catholicism now is outside Europe? Uh, you know,
I
e-
think.
Go ahead,
I
please.
think they must. I think they must be. And indeed, obviously, there are more non-European cardinals than ever before. This won't stop them necessarily appointing an Italian.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a sort of feeling that there hasn't been an Italian for a long time, when, of course, there was virtual Italian monopoly on the office for so many
Yeah.
centuries. But Cardinal Muller, I think, they sort of suggested that if the next pope was in any sense sort of as it were, other than totally traditional and conservative, there could be a schism. And I think that is absurd. I think that's merely sort of frightening, or attempting frightening tactics, which really didn't seem to be at all credible. But on the other hand, it could be. I suspect it would depend on the individual. I mean, these pre-conclave discussions that they hold, and as has often been pointed out, of course, they don't actually know each other very well. This is the only occasion which they all come together.
Oh, the cardinals don't know each other very well. Okay.
I mean, the ones who live and work in Rome obviously know each other, but they're a minority. This is the first occasion, really, for well, since 2013, in which all of the kind of the cardinals from around the world come together and have an extended period of time in each other's company, and obviously hear each other as we make formal presentations and get to know what kind of as it were, values they have, and what kind of virtues or vices indeed they display. So I don't think that there would be a decision made on the basis, for example, we ought to have an African this time round. But it may be that, for example, an African cardinal strikes them as the person who has the ability and the particular skills that they feel are now required.
Interesting.
So, we will watch this space with interest.
Yeah. So while we may not get a pope from outside Europe, or like an African or a cardinal or something, they do hold sway over what happens in Rome. Because, as you said, in the conclave, correct me if I'm wrong, a minority of cardinals reside in Italy. Many of them are going to gather there specifically for this conclave. Very interesting. Dr. Collins, thank you so much for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much, Dr. Collins. This was wonderful.
Great pleasure. Thank you.